I'm excited that we have Jose back with us. I know it has been a long journey for him, and he is still healing, but I'm glad that he's able to worship with us. I'm glad he's out of that hospital, and I'm glad he can eat some food besides the hospital food. And I'll tell you, one thing about him is through all of that, you're talking about a person that was still ministering. He was still ministering to people that were coming by. And so, as I kind of mentioned, those people that were with Paul must have felt like they were a captive audience. I would imagine some of the nurses felt the same way with Jose, because he was getting involved in their lives, praying with them, and just doing some amazing things, even though he wasn't in the best of situations. And so that's an example right there, and I appreciate that, brother. For us, a name is important. I say the name Jose just then, and that means something. That doesn't just mean any Jose. It means, I'm going to say it, our Jose. And so, a name is important. I know that when both me and my sister were born, they wanted to make sure they had some names picked out. And my mom, being a teacher, it was very difficult to find a name that didn't make her think about somebody else in her class that she didn't want to think about when she was looking at her kids. So she had to go through a whole string of names. And so, I was going to make a joke about something, but I'm not going to do that. But when you think about that, a name is pretty important. And you look at the God of Genesis. There are 4 different names, and on your outline, there's 4 different names. You see in Hebrew what they are. And so looking at them, we're going to look at 4 different names that really reveal about our God. Because when we think of our God, I'm hoping that some of these things that I talk about, and hopefully don't get too emotional about, will resonate with you like they did me. And so some of these are pretty interesting. And so the first one, Elohim, is very interesting. It is it's the plural of Eloha, and it's a plural word with a singular meaning. And it comes out right there at the very beginning of the text, the very beginning of the Bible message that we have. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form or void, and darkness was over the whole face of the deep, and the spirit of Elohim was hovering over the face of the waters. And Elohim said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And Elohim said, the light was good. Elohim separated the light from darkness. Elohim called the light day and the darkness night. And as you go through, there is no other name for God in chapter 1 but Elohim, which kind of goes along with me talking about it's a plural word for a singular meaning, because in verse 26, then Elohim said, "Let us make God in our own image, after our likeness." And so we see that there's I guess what you would say, good evidence for the Trinity. For God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit right here in this first chapter. And as he goes through, it's also interesting that theos is what they used in the Greek for Elohim in the Hebrew. And in John 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then it talks a little later on that Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. It talks about the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. All one and the same. It talks about the Spirit in verse 2 here, the Spirit of Elohim. So you have God the Son, God the Spirit, and God the Father all wrapped up here in chapter 1, as well as in the beginning of John chapter 1, verse 1. This would be the Creator. If you have your blank and you want to fill it in, this would be Elohim. This is the Creator. Now, there's a lot of things that some people say they create, and they make things, but they're making things out of things that already exist. So what I consider them as compilers. But God is the maker. He is the creator, making it out of nothing. And so he reveals himself first as Elohim, the creator, powerful, mighty, Lord of lords. He is stronger and mightier than anything or anyone. And so for us, when it's impossible, when we face things that it's impossible, when we face circumstances, when we face adversaries, when we face difficulties, we have to know and we have to remember Elohim, the creator, the one that's stronger and mightier. He is stronger than anything that we're ever going to face. From the first sentence, he talks about who he is. He is stronger. And so the whole point is we're obsessed with worshiping. You can look in Acts chapter 17, how they worshiped all these different things. We're obsessed with worshiping. We're created to worship. And for us, we know who we worship. We worship Elohim. But there are some that worship themselves, some that worship other people, some that worship things that were compiled. Some people worship things that are other than God. And we all seem to want control. And so while we want to worship and while we want control, we must see our limitations. We can't. There's no way. We have limitations, but he has no limitations. And that's this next thing. He is Elohim, the creator, and he has no limitations. Because when we can't, he can. And that is the amazing thing, is that we have a God that can help us when we can't. After all, he is the creator. And then we have the next. The next one is Yahweh. And most people think that that's the way it was pronounced, although no one is for certain. Because they took the vowels, there were no vowels. Because they were fearful of being able to say this. And so it began to where it was, in your version, it will say the word in capital Lord. In the American Standard, it'll have the word Jehovah. And that'd be the English, transliteration of that word. And so, but most people say that Yahweh would be the pronunciation, and the meaning, it means the existing one. So, number one, you have the creator. Now you have the existing one, the one that is present. And the name simply means he is. But they didn't want to say the word Yahweh because of Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. They'd refer to this, and it says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Now, if you were at my school, you would hear this on a consistent basis, a consistent correction. What are you doing? What'd you bring Jesus into this? Oh, what are you talking about? Well, you just said his name. And you said it in a profane way. In other words, you said it in a common way, like you're calling me Michael. Oh, Michael, come here. We can't use God's name in vain, acting as though this is a common term. He says, I am uncommon. I'm the existing one. Before anything I was, and after anything I will be. Here, they didn't want to take the name of the Lord in vain. It says, "For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." In Leviticus 24:16 it says, "Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord will surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him, the sojourner as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death." That was a serious thing. It wasn't one of those things where you have people texting OMG. A euphemism for "oh my God," and you're saying it in a common way. It should be "oh my God, my Savior, my deliverer, my rock, my shield, my salvation, my fortress." It should be used in a way that means something. And here, they didn't want to do that, so they just decided not to say the name. And instead, they would use another name that we're going to be talking about. But a lot of times, you will see, we'll just look at the first time it's referenced, is Genesis chapter 2. Now, it's interesting. you have Genesis chapter 1, and it talks about what he can do, his power, what he can accomplish. He creates. And then in chapter 2, as it goes on here, it mentions, and by the way, I didn't read all the different times it talks and it says Elohim in chapter 1 or throughout the Bible, but it is hundreds. And then in chapter 2, all of a sudden, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "And thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day, Elohim finished the work that he had done and rested on the seventh day from the work that he had done. So Elohim blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it Elohim rested from all the work he had done in creation. All the generations of the heavens and the earth, when they were created, in the day of the Yahweh Elohim made the earth and the heavens." And then in verse 5, it says, "There was no bush in the field yet in the land, and no small plant in the field yet had sprung up. For Yahweh Elohim had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. In the midst," verse 6, "in the midst was going up from the land and watering the whole face of the ground. Then Yahweh Elohim formed man from the dust, from the ground, and breathed in his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living creature. And Yahweh Elohim planted a garden in Eden." And in verse 9, "And out of the ground Yahweh Elohim made a spring, or made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food." And so, as you see, and I could keep reading chapter 2, but as you see, there is a difference. Because Elohim, the creator, now is Yahweh, the existing one. And there is the connection here. Talks about in chapter 1 how he creates all these things. Chapter 2, he's talking about us. He's talking about us. He's talking about the relationship. There's a connection that's different from everything else created. He is talking about making mankind. And here we can see a glimpse. And so looking at Yahweh in your outline, it's the existing one. And the word itself is, the aspect of it is that he is present. He is always present. From Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, from the very beginning, he is present. And then you go and you look at Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, and you see Moses, you see a burning bush. And he asked, what his name is. And he said, "I am." When they ask about me, you tell them I am sent you. I am the I am. I'm the existing one. That's a derivative of Yahweh. He's telling them who he is. He is saying, "This is me." And then in John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus is saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." Now, it's not the exact Hebrew word that he's using, because it's the New Testament's in Greek. But he's given the same understanding, because they understood from that context, they understood that he was saying, "I'm God. I'm Yahweh in the flesh." And then at the very end of Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." He is saying once again in another way of, "I'm Yahweh. I am present." He is. It's an amazing thing when you start thinking about, we have a God who gives us, this would be considered his proper name. That's, excuse me, that's why Edward, when he gets up, he oftentimes says Jehovah, because the transliterated word for Yahweh, because that is his proper name. And all through the American Standard Version, it mentions Yahweh. And so for us, you think about all the different things. Yahweh says he's present. That means, if we take that means, like in Psalm 107, verse 13, it says, "Then he cried to the Lord, to Yahweh, in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress." He delivers. He's always present, so he knows how to do it. In Psalm 25, verse 11, for your name's sake, O Yahweh, pardon my guilt, for it is great. He's the one that can forgive. In Psalm 31, verses 1 through 4, in you, O Yahweh, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake you lead me and guide me. You take me out of the net they have hidden for me. You are my refuge. And so he's able to guide. And so we have Yahweh that's able to help always. He's present, so that means he knows, he understands, he cares, he delivers, he forgives, he saves, and he wants a relationship with you. And that's what he's telling you. He's going through, and this is an intimate thing. He's telling you his name. So in class, you have a teacher, and that teacher in class, whatever class grade that was, but your teacher, whatever class it is, you go in, and the first day they say, hello, my name is Mrs. So-and-so, or my name is Ms. So-and-so, or Miss So-and-so, or Mr. So-and-so. They all tell you their name, but they're not telling you their first name. I didn't go into a class ever and say, hey, my name's Michael Todd. Yeah, you just call me Mike. You call me Mike for short. I didn't know. That's an intimate thing. You don't tell your students to call, because there's a distance, there's a disconnect there. There is the teacher and the student. Here, our God is saying, my name is Yahweh, and I want you to call me Yahweh. He's telling you, he's giving you intimates here. There's an intimacy when he's telling you his name. He's desiring a relationship with you. And so you can see, as David through the Psalms, he cries out Yahweh often because there's that intimacy. And so for us, a name means something. He is present. And when you aren't, he is. Because we can't always be there every time, but our Yahweh can. Our Jehovah can. Our God can. He's the creator. He is existing one. He always has and always will be. And then you look at the third. The third is Adonai. And that is a word that usually it's usually used when Greeks or Gentiles are being talked about. And its opposite, Yahweh, is when it's talking about the people of Israel, God's people. And so here, Adonai is what they would use. Oftentimes they would call God or Yahweh Adonai because that was a difference. That means master. That means a ruler. That means the sovereign. And so you have several things here in your Bible. Yahweh would be all capital Lord. So when it says all capital Lord, that's the word that it's referring to. When it's a capital L for Lord and everything else lowercase, that would be the number 3 word. That'd be Adonai. And so it just means master. It means Lord. It means the sovereignty, the sovereign. That means he's reigning. And in the New Testament, Kyrios is the word for the Greek. And so when we see that, it's the same. You would say this would be in Greek and this would be in Hebrew. And the aspect is that he has, the whole context is that he has the right to rule over us. It's an owner speaking of a relationship that doesn't have to. It's not a tyrant. It's a loving leader. It's a loving ruler. And God's in total possession, and we should be in total submission. And so he is the God over all. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords. And he reigns forever. And we ought to be able to find safety and security in that. Because we know tomorrow he's going to still reign. And the next day he's going to still reign. The rules of the game are not going to be changed. And so we see the first mention of this in Genesis chapter 15. And so Genesis chapter 15, which I think is interesting. In Genesis 15, he says, after these things, in verse 1, the word of Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision. So the proper name is put out there. And it says, fear not, Abram, for I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abraham, notice what he says. He says, oh, Adonai, Elohim, what will you give me? For I continue childless. So he doesn't refer him as Yahweh. He says Adonai, Elohim. So he shows the respect, and he gives him that respect. And then in verse 7, he says, and he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, oh, Adonai Elohim. He's not even saying the proper name. There's so much respect there. It's kind of like a professor that I had years ago. He said, you freshmen, you can call me Dr. Wilson. And you sophomores, you call me Mr. Wilson. You juniors, you can call me Jimmy. And you seniors, you can call me Jimmy Baby. And he would just, be humorous about that, because as you get a little bit closer to graduation, we're going to be kind of equal. Here, Abraham knows there's no equality. He knows where his place is and who is reigning. Now, here's one who is great, but he is saying, you're greater. And it's amazing here that we have this connection, how he addresses him, even though he is told about him. Because you look in verse 13 and it says, and Yahweh said to Abram. And then in verse 18, on the day the Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham. And so each time, though, it's still going to be Adonai Elohim. And so we have Adonai, this is the master. This is the Lord. This is the ruler. And he is in total control. And that would be for that blank there. He is in total control. And this would be where we get the challenge for us in Matthew chapter 7. 21 through 23, it says, Lord, Lord. Or actually, he says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? This is the same type of aspect. He's saying, why are you saying I'm your Lord and you're not doing anything I'm saying? It's just, you're just giving a voice, and it's meaningless. You're giving a name and you're throwing it out and it has nothing to it. And there's a lot of people that want to be in charge. I know a lot of people that they feel like they want to be the boss, no matter what business that is, or what school district that is. They want to be in charge. You have a bunch of kids, and there's always one wanting to take charge. You have a team. There's always wanting to take charge. Well, he really is in charge. We act like we're in charge because we want to be in control. And we think we are in control. You think that you are probably in control at this moment. I mean, you got up on your own, maybe a little help of an alarm clock. But you got up, you dressed yourself, took a shower maybe last night or this morning. And you got up here, you're in charge, in control this day. And the amazing thing is all the different things that had to take place for you to get here, that we're really not in charge. Because I didn't wake myself up. God woke me up. God allowed me to keep breathing through the night. God allowed me the strength to put my clothes on. He gave me the comprehension to be able to know exactly where I'm going to go, even though I can just walk over here. But either way, he gave me the understanding. And so you think about all these things. We go into this facade that we're really in control, and we're not. We're not in charge. We're not in control. It's a facade. And, I've told you about the more that you're, in charge of other people, that's the more of a servant that you are. And we've got the greatest servant of all. But he really is in charge. He's the one that really does call the shots. He reigns. And the amazing thing about his reign, he's like no other ruler ever. Because he desires to be with you. He desires to know you, to have a relationship with you. And so, when you don't, he does. When you don't have control, he does. He's in full control. When you can't, he can. And when you aren't, he is. And when you don't, he does. And then in chapter 17 of Genesis, we have the last and final name that God gives himself for us to understand of who he is. And he says in verse 1, he says, then Abraham was 99 years old. The Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make a covenant between you and me, and may multiply you greatly. And then in verse 3, then Abram fell on his face, and Elohim said to him, man, we've got 3 of them right here, don't we? And so looking at this, El Shaddai means provider. He is the provider. The essence of it is that he is mighty, he is most powerful, and then he is more than enough. And so your second blank would be, he is enough. There doesn't need to be anything else. He is enough. And just to kind of go through this with you, if you looked over in chapter 12 of Genesis, you see there's promises that are given, promises that have been made. In verse 1, he said, you're going to have a land. Verse 2, he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And the end of verse 2, he says, I'm going to make you a blessing. And that all will be blessed through you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you in verse 3. And then in verse 4, you can see how old he is. He's 75 years old at this time. And that's important to remember. And then look in chapter 16. In chapter 16, it's been a little while. Chapter 16, verse 16, the last verse in the chapter, it says Abram was 86. Now he's 86. So looking at that, now we've got 11 years difference, and still the promise has not been made. He still doesn't even have a kid. And so he decided to listen to his wife, and he decides to go ahead and have a child by another woman. He thought about having one of his servants inherit everything and give it through that so his lineage goes on. But you see, he's 75. He was given the promises. 86 still hasn't happened, but God listens. And God does say, surely, in verse 10, I will multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. So he's saying this is still going to happen. It's still 11 years. Now he's 86. I mean, every year that passes on, it gets more and more difficult. And so now all of a sudden, look in chapter 17. In chapter 17, verse 1, it says that Abram was 99 years old. And Yahweh appears to him, and he says, I am El Shaddai. I am almighty. So I don't know why you're questioning. It's been 24 years, and you've been questioning. I told you what was going to happen. Now you think about that. He's finally told him. He's told him over and over again, I am Elohim. I am Yahweh. And he's been called Adonai. And now he says, listen, I just need you to focus on me. Listen to what I'm saying to you. 75, I told you what was going to happen. And the 86, you try to make it on your own, try to come up with your own plan that was different than my plan. And 99, and I'm telling you, you're wondering, and I'm telling you, don't wonder. I'm telling you, I am El Shaddai. I am enough. And for us, isn't that what it should be? Shouldn't be God enough? Shouldn't he be all that we need? Because that's what he's telling you. He's saying, I am enough. And when you have it, he has. He has everything that you need. And then some. He tells you in Matthew chapter 6, you don't worry. Don't be anxious about what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear. I'm going to provide it if you just seek me. Remember, I am the provider. I've got more than enough. And you start looking at this. We have one that loves us. We have one that forgives us, one that has a plan for us, one that provides for us. And so you look at the Creator, the fact that he can when you can't. And there's a lot of things we can't do, but we act like we're in full control. And he goes on, and he is there every time. When other people in your life aren't present, he always is. Now think about that. That should give a person comfort to when they go and talk to God, he is always present. He's always ready to hear. He's always ready to save. He's always ready to deliver. He always wants a relationship with you. And when you don't have, he does. He can when you can't. And the last one is when you haven't got it, he has. He's got more than enough. Instead of going to him at the last, go to him at the very beginning. We have a God that has more than enough. And we can't accept God as El Shaddai, as the provider, until we realize who he really is. He is the Elohim. He is the creator. He's Yahweh. He is. He's the existing one. Always has, always will be. There is a constant there. And he is that constant. When everything else in this world is not constant and the pendulum seems to be swinging back and forth in our society, he is our constant. And he is our master. And so knowing that, if we can accept him as our God, our creator, accept him as Yahweh, our existing one, accept him as Adonai, our master, then we're going to realize he is El Shaddai. He's more than enough. He's more than enough. He's the one that made us. He's the one that loves us. He's the one that reigns. And he's the one that provides. He's got everything there. And he tells us in the first 17 chapters of this book who he is. He tells us his name. He tells us the intimate name. We, with his names, understand who he is. It's hard to understand some people unless you spend time with them. Well, it's hard to understand God unless you spend time with him. And so I encourage you to spend time with our Creator. I encourage you to spend time with the one who is. He is. The simple name is just he is. That says it all. And the one that provides and the one that reigns. All that should be comforting to you. And so if there's something you need to be asking God for and you want us to be asking on your behalf, let us know, because I do know one that is always present. He's always ready to hear your prayers. And I know one who wants a relationship with you more than anything else. So much. He loved this world so much. He sends his son to die for us, as it talks about in some people's favorite verse of John 3:16. And so for us, there's some things that we need to do if you haven't done. One of them is you need to believe in him. And if you believe in him, well, how you can believe is look at what he does. Spend time reading, and it will cause you to believe. The miracles themselves cause you to believe that Jesus is God's son. But you got to believe from Mark chapter 16, verse 16, and you've got to change. In Acts chapter 2, verse 38, you can't stay just doing you. You've got to focus and say, this is all about God right now. And I'm going to live his way. I'm tired of living my way because it ends in dead ends. It ends in heartbreak and hardship. But doing it God's way, man, you've got joy. And then, in both of those two verses, in Mark 16, verse 16, and Acts chapter 2, verse 38, it tells us that we have to be immersed. We have to be immersed in water for the purpose of, in Mark, salvation, which is the same thing in Acts chapter 2, which is forgiveness of sins. And so whatever your need is, please don't wait. Please don't hesitate. Please come while we stand and sing.